when we say culture today, or when most folks say it, it's in the HR context, human resources, and we're talking about trusting each other, respecting each other, playing nice. All of those things are very important. That's a great conversation around traditional definition of culture. But for those of y'all in high school or maybe in college courses that took a course on world cultures, what did you study? Did you study how to act as a team and how to fulfill a mission? No, you studied language, food, art, philosophy, clothing, everything that sets another culture apart from a different culture.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you are tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now, turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, I am proud to interview my co-host and co-founder of Beyond Clean, Hank Balch. He's also our president, and he began his career in instrument reprocessing as a frontline technician in 2009. And has served as an instrument database specialist, department manager, and system director for various SPD departments across the country. Hank is an award-winning sterile processing leader, 2016 Healthcare Purchasing News CSSPD Department of the Year, twice nominated for ISHM president, founder of 2 statewide ISHM chapters, conference speakers, and well-known industry writer, blogger, and social media connoisseur. And we didn't even note the fact that he is also a world-renowned podcaster. He has over 150 sterile processing articles, with his work being published in Becker's Hospital Review, Infection Control Today, Healthcare Purchasing News, Outpatient Surgery Magazine, Amy BINT Journal, Sterile World, and other publications across the globe. And I don't need to tell you, his passion is seeing frontline sterile processing professionals equipped to fight dirty every instrument, every time. And I know so many of you are familiar with Hank because of his voice, co-hosting these podcasts and writing and his social media presence and everything else. But amazingly, we have gotten through 10 full seasons, and we're almost halfway through season 11. And this will be the very first time where we get to sit down and interview Hank Balch. And you're going to get a real inside look into the way that Hank really views just how big sterile processing can be. And so we're going to be talking about building an industry worth loving today with Hank Balch, and I know you're going to walk away incredibly inspired. We'll be right back after a short break with Hank Balch.
You're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Hank Balch, founder and president at Beyond Clean. And when I say joining us, I mean, Hank, it's just you and me. And I'm really excited to talk to you. Last season, you had a chance to interview me, and now I have the great pleasure of interviewing you. And I believe that rounds out at least every contributor to Beyond Clean has now been a guest on one of our episodes. It took you till season 11, but here we are, and I know you've got something good for us today.
Well, Justin, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be a part of this tremendous podcast. I am honored that you invited me and I invited myself. And, it's funny how that works. But seriously, the team is growing so quickly that actually we've got another person that we need to interview next season. That's a good problem to have, run out of podcast spots for the folks on the Beyond Clean team to share their story. But in all seriousness, I'm thrilled to talk about the topic that we're going to talk about today. Hopefully encourage some folks to think a little bit deeper about what makes our industry tick.
Well, and I'm going to give everybody a little bit of insider knowledge since this is sort of a special and unique interview, because even when we've interviewed our other teammates here at Beyond Clean, it's been you and I doing the interviewing, or maybe it's been Bob and I or Mike and I doing the interviewing. But this is a little bit more of a conversation back and forth. But when we set up to do these interviews with the guests, you always come up with a really catchy way to describe or a catchy title for the episode. And I'm not going to read all of it, but Bigger Than Us. And you tee that up because this industry is bigger than us, but I have a feeling you're about to make it seem a whole lot bigger than any of us ever thought.
If you look at the conversations in our industry, so much of it has to do with the topic of this interview. It comes back ultimately to what I would describe as culture. And I'm going to kind of nuance that, through this conversation. It's not the culture, I think, that most people think when they hear that word. But even, conversations around recognition or around having pride as a sterile processing technician. I think all of that, if we're going to categorize it, should be put in the category of our industry culture. And so, yeah, it goes deep, it goes broad. As I like to do, if it's naming an episode or if it's coming up with catchy mottos and slogan like "We Fight Dirty," which is the motto of Beyond Clean, I try very hard to put concepts together like what we're going to be discussing tonight in a way that punches to the heart. It gets to the heart of the question or the topic or the education, whatever it is. And I think that Bigger Than Us slogan is a reality in sterile processing, in our company, in each of our lives. Everything is bigger than us if you really think about it. Like I was thinking just the other day about the size of the universe and watching this video about some ninth planet they discovered and just how far away from the sun it was. And it was just crazy, just massive universe. Well, if you look at an industry like sterile processing, it's such a niche industry, and yet it's a global industry. And there's folks in every country on the planet doing sterile processing, all these standards and all these instruments, and everything is just so big. And yet I think there's a unifying factor around all that comes back at the end of the day to culture.
Well, so the other thing that we try not to do in recording these podcasts is we try not to do the interview ahead of time. And so purposefully, you have sheltered me from this topic. So I can tell you that as I ask you these questions today, it's very organic as it's going to be coming off the top of my head. But a couple of things you just said stand out just in terms of the outline that we're using to structure the conversation. Culture, which I'm going to start with, but you also said it comes at the heart of it. And the second half of your title for this is what it really means to build an industry worth loving, which, that's really what the heart is all about. And then pride. That was something you kind of leaked out right before we got started. And the pride piece, if you really love it and you really enjoy it, and then you do a really good job and you take pride in your work, they're all interrelated. But I want to start with culture because I love talking about culture, but it's probably to a point sometimes where I almost come off as a cliche because I'm always pointing to culture. You even tease me sometimes like, Justin, you're always taking this psychological approach. But I want to not only define culture, but really this is going to get at the heart of this whole interview. This isn't about department culture. This conversation's really about industry culture. And I hadn't really thought of it that way until you introduced this idea for your interview. Can you define the difference between department culture and industry culture so we can really start to take a deeper dive into the conversation?
There's a lot of different types of culture. I think department culture is a good starting point. It's the kind of culture that most of us are familiar with. It's what most folks mean in our industry when we say the word culture. I love department culture. I've written a ton about cultures in department, creating cultures of growth, creating cultures of excellence. As a sterile processing technician and manager, I really drove that cultural conversation home. If it's hiring someone off the street, I hired for culture, right? If it was promoting someone, I promoted for culture because I wanted them to match the feel of our department, to not just come in and know how to do sterile processing, but do it the way that we did it at our facility for the reasons that we did it, right? So that's department culture. That's that experience that you get if you're a sterile processing traveler. I know you've experienced this. You walk into a facility and they're using the same equipment, they have the same instruments, but there's a different feel. That feel that you get, that's their culture. Sometimes it's more controllable than others, kind of takes on a life of its own, but that's the difference. And every hospital on the planet that you walk into has a different department culture. Now, as you take a look at industry culture, and this is the big theme and overarching, point of this episode, is our industry culture is not or should not be different from facility to facility. I think ultimately it shouldn't even be different from country to country, and definitely not different from certification organization to certification organization. I think our industry deserves and is yearning after a overarching industry culture that gives us that pride that you mentioned, Justin, of being a sterile processing technician and that meaning the same thing as it means for someone who's a sterile processing technician in Canada or in Australia, right? So what is that meaning and what is that theme that goes through all of our departments and everything else that we do is sterile processing? That's the big takeaway for defining industry culture.
Well, you're an innovator and a disruptor at heart, and it's really driven a lot of what we do and what we like to highlight in the departments, that when we interview people who are doing great things, when we interview entrepreneurs and companies that are doing great things in the industry. But I have a feeling that at the heart of that innovation and disruption is the desire to improve on what we already have today. So can you tell us or give us a state of affairs as you see sterile processing culture today before you start telling us what the building blocks and what the vision should be for the future?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of descriptors that I would use, and we'll start with certification. I think in a lot of places, if we were honest with ourselves and just how we think about the industry and everything, we think in terms of a certification culture. It defines who we are, especially on social media. Like you see when folks get certified, they share out that certification as a big cultural milestone in their career. Now they have arrived in that upper echelon of sterile processing culture. Now they're certified. And so we define ourselves or compare ourselves to each other on, are you certified or you're not certified? If you are certified, which certifications do you have? If you have multiple certifications, which certification organization are you aligned with? Right? And there's not always hard feelings, but there are some differences between those certification organizations in the United States. But again, if we look globally and we compare ourselves, well, in the US, we're sterile processing folks, but outside of certification now, we follow AAMI, the AAMI guidelines. And then you look globally, and there are some other countries around the globe that follow the AAMI guidelines, but there's others that don't have their own guidelines. Again, Australia is a good example of this. And so whether it's just a certification culture, it's a guideline culture, I think the state of affairs today in sterile processing culture is a very divided, inconsistent narrative, meta narrative, just the big story of our industry. I think it's very siloed, not to use that cliche that we hate to use, but it's a big silo out there between who you're certified under, which guidelines you follow. Even now, with multiple accrediting organizations out there, there's more ways to categorize ourselves, and there's not as many conversations like we're having today with how do we build a united self-consciousness of our industry. And that goes back to finding a way to talk through these silos, to talk through certifications, through national boundaries, and the way that we do on this podcast, and build a conversation that takes us to that level of breaking out of the walls that we've built for ourselves in the current state of affairs as it is today.
Okay. So, I'm going to go back to pride, because that certification can be a great source of pride. And I think you described that. But I'm thinking that's just one piece of a reason why somebody should have pride in what they do or pride in their industry. And so is pride a good place for you to start building this bigger picture of what our industry culture could look like or should look like?
Yeah, Justin, I think pride, or even going back to the title of this episode, what it means to really build an industry worth loving, between pride and love, those two can really form the building blocks for a successful industry culture. We want to build an industry that you can be proud about working in and not ashamed of working in. We want to build an industry that you can love, not one that you hate having to get up every morning and go to work. And even though there are department implications and cultural implications for those decisions, I think there's also industry level culture that can be created that can cause you to have more pride in what you do and to love the industry that you do more than you do today.
All right. So before you tell us, and I know you kind of accused me this when we were doing mine. You were saying, Justin, you keep kind of getting there, but you're not really coming clean with us. And I know we're close. I can't wait for you to tell us how we can do this. But before we even do that, maybe we need to appeal to everybody's self-serving nature to some extent, which is, what's in it for me? And so If we do this, and because I can imagine this isn't something that is just easily done throughout your normal day. And it's going to take some extra effort to build on this culture. It's going to take time away from work. So what you're selling sounds really good, but then you're going to tell us all the things that we have to do to help really raise it and get it where it should be. And so at the end of the day, what's in it for the people that are doing the job every day? If we all build this industry worth loving and this industry culture, what do we stand to get out of that?
Well, I've got good news. I firmly believe that one person on a mission can change the world, right? So this is a big topic. We're talking about industry shaking, industry disrupting, like you mentioned earlier. I love disruption, but you don't have to love disruption to make a traumatic difference in your region, in your state, in your country, in your entire industry. You don't have to be anyone special. You don't have to be known. You don't have to have a title. You don't have to hold an office. All you have to do is be passionate about an industry and love it and want to change it. So, the good news out of all this, Justin, is anybody can do it, and it can start in small ways. It doesn't have to be on the front page of a sterile processing magazine or at a national conference. You can do things today, tomorrow, that can start changing the industry culture in the direction that you feel like it needs to go, according to your passion and your vision, to drive more pride in what you do and in what your department does, and drive more love of the industry. It is really changing patients' lives. So, the big takeaway is not this is huge and therefore it's impossible. I want people to say, hey, this is huge, but one action, one decision, one person can make a huge difference.
Well, you just used the term mission. That's really going to center around having a real passion and being willing to share why it's important and the successes. And I'm sure you're going to tell us that there's lots of unique ways that we can do that. I just know you. And you're always coming up with really good ideas. And I've known you for a while now, but not not really that long compared to some of my other lifelong friends, but it's been 3.5 years. But one thing I know about you is the gears never stop turning, and you always come up with unique and different, creative and good ideas. And so starting small, what can the listeners, what can sterile processing professionals do? And now I'm going to take the word you used, mission, but I'm going to spin it a different way. And I'm going to say we're recruiting everybody to get on this mission of building an industry culture. So what can they do to contribute to our mission?
Yeah, well, it starts with how you think about culture. And this goes back to the first question out of the box, like, what are we talking about here? And that's so important to realize when we say culture today, or when most folks say it, it's in the HR context, human resources, and we're talking about trusting each other, respecting each other, playing nice. All of those things are very important. That's a great conversation around traditional definition of culture. But for those of y'all in high school or maybe in college courses that took a course on world cultures, what did you study? Did you study how to act as a team and how to fulfill a mission? No, you studied language, food, art, philosophy, clothing, everything that sets another culture apart from a different culture, right? So that is much closer to the definition of the industry culture that I'm talking about. So I'm going to go small here to those specifics, Justin, like you asked, what does it look like? Well, believe it or not, in just the last 2 years, I've encountered 3 different people who have created music that touches the sterile processing industry, right? There's a guy out in California that did this terrific song on Instagram and Facebook about a major tray. And he sang this like 3.5, 4 minute song with his little guitar about a major tray and how he just loves his major tray and he loves the smell of it. And it's his major tray. It's his go-to tray. Last September, so like a year ago at the World Congress in the Netherlands, I saw a gentleman with a guitar up on stage singing a song about sterile processing. Actually, one of our former guests, Christina Fast, was his backup singer for that song. So if you heard the episode with Christina, that's another example of getting at in those small creative ways that make people and make us proud about who we are as individuals and who we are even outside in our cultures, like what makes you, French Canadian, Justin, or what makes me a Texan. There's certain things that we know and associate with those cultural categories. Well, what makes our industry an industry that's worth being proud about in the way that I'm proud that I'm a Texan, or being excited about the way that you may get when you hear Zydeco music? I don't know. That's actually probably French Canadian in Louisiana.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I'm much more of a grunge guy, Hank.
You're right. But you get what I'm saying, right?
Well, can I ask you a question about that then? Because
Sure.
what I'm hearing is that these cultures can all overlap. If we think about culture in such a silo, which I think is what you were getting at before, we sit in these walls and they define ourselves. And when we really affiliate ourselves with one singular culture, it's very limiting. And when we begin to look at culture as sort of like these overlapping circles, then we start seeing the benefits of bringing one culture to another culture and how that really has a chance to just elevate everything that we do. And I heard you describe art as part of the culture. And so there's these elements of the cultures that maybe are missing in sterile processing culture as an industry, or they're emerging, but maybe they're not getting as much attention as they should as we build an industry culture. Because you know what it should be? The industry culture could be a sense of humor that we all have. That, maybe we have thick skin, but that we can survive. We're resilient. When we start talking about what we want that SPD culture to look like, and then we can aspire to be that culture and build more on those building blocks, then we can really take this somewhere. Am I at all onto your vision for this?
I would say those overlapping cultures that's more of what's going on today. It's the difference between when I say every heart surgeon thinks they're God, right? Anyone who's ever met a heart surgeon, the likelihood of that being true is pretty good, right? Because that's a cultural reference to a particular job in a particular industry. Heart surgeons just think they are. If you hold someone's life literally in your hands, like they do with a heart, and they start it and stop it, like I could understand how that could go to your head. Well, to your point, like what you said at the end there is getting much closer to what I'm saying is, what are those similarities that if you met a sterile processing technician from France on the street, what would you talk about? Would you have things in common, and what would they be in common? And are there other things that you should have in common, but are just not there yet? They're not created yet. And you referenced art. This goes back to a series we started, maybe 12 months ago now, but it was the Beyond Clean Art series, where we had a graphic designer put together just some terrific pieces of sterile processing artwork. The first of its kind, right? There's not a lot of sterile processing art out there today. It's highlighting who we are as an industry and what our job looks like for the public who are never going to be able to go into a sterile processing department. But here you have on these pieces of artwork a technician sitting at a table paying extremely close attention to the surgical clamps that are in front of them, right? Well, that art communicates and transfers the same way in Chicago as it does in the Philippines, right? You see that picture, hey, that's what I do. That's me. This is my industry, right? So that's what I'm talking about, creating these conduits for culture that span across the regional boundaries, span across certification distinctions and everything else, but unite us in a way that pulls out that pride, that creates that deeper feeling of respect toward an industry as opposed to it
And
just being a
belonging.
job. Yeah, totally. Right.
Yeah, Hank, as I reflect on what you're saying, it just really occurs to me that having this pride and this sense of belonging, and really ultimately by building, an industry culture, this higher sense of purpose, like just that attitude and that approach every single week could really have an impact on improving patient safety.
It goes down to something as simple and mundane as, why do people leave our industry, right? Because we ask that all the time. We're talking about staffing turnover, and there's huge compensation debates, right, that we're right in the middle of. But a lot of it has to do with that distinction between viewing sterile processing as a job or viewing it as a career. And that career piece, if you commit your life to something, like, you got one life, and you're going to say, I'm going to commit all of it to a particular industry. Well, if you don't love the industry, that's an interesting decision that you're making. And on the opposite end, how do we cause people to love an industry outside of just what it pays and what the benefits are? And I think this cultural conversation has to be a huge piece of that.
All right, Hank. So as we're getting ready to wrap this up, I'm now going to put you on the spot. I want you to tell me, and you've already done a lot, right? All the writing, the work at Beyond Clean. You mentioned the artwork as something that was very innovative that can bring more value to this industry culture concept. But what I really want to know, since I threw some positivity your way earlier, that you're always creative, you're always surprising me. So what are you going to do?
Yeah, well, let me flip that around real quick and say, I think anyone and everyone who's listening to this episode can and should do something to be building industry culture. And I'll use myself as an example. When I was a young technician, I felt like the only way to change the industry was this very specific, narrow route. I had to have a particular title. I had to hold a particular office. I could only change the industry if I took these specific steps. Well, here we are 10, 11 years later, and I realized, no, You find what you are passionate about, whatever it is. If it's graphic design, if it's podcast, if it's writing, if it's creating t-shirts. I told someone just the other day, 3-4 years ago, almost no sterile processing t-shirts on the market. Today, t-shirts are everywhere. Why? Because we're seeing our industry culture change right before our eyes, where there's more pride, there's more creative opportunity out there for folks to tell our story. I want people to be encouraged and inspired to take your skill set, even if it's the most random thing in the world, like podcasting, for instance. Take what you love and what you're good at outside of work and see how you can build that in to the industry in a way that causes you personally to love it more. Now, here's one example of what I'm planning to do. In the spring of 2020, my wife and I, we've actually already started this, are going to be publishing a children's book about the sterile processing industry. And it's actually going to be 2 different children's books. We're going to have one, it's called My Daddy Fights Dirty. And we're going to have one that says My Mommy Fights Dirty. And why we're going to do it? Because we want to write about our industry, specifically for kids whose parents work in sterile processing, to start and help communicate what it is mommy and daddy does every day when they leave for work, and why it's so cool and important and big, so that this next generation of folks grow up, at least our children know what we do, right? Even if the public at large don't know what we do. That's just one specific example, Justin, but there is limitless opportunities like that to look beyond the technical, to look beyond the work groups and the credentials, as important as those are, and build a bigger, broader, more inclusive industry culture that wraps in not only our state and our region, but the whole globe. We can join together as a sterile processing industry and be proud of who we are and what we do.
Well, Hank, you never cease to inspire. I will say that. And I'm very proud to say that you and I have been doing this podcast because you make me feel good about this project, because that's what it was when it started, was very simply, how can I take something that I do in my spare time that I enjoy, that I love doing, and bring it to, my career. I had no idea that I might be contributing to this concept that you're bringing to us about developing industry culture. And so I just want to thank you for sharing your insights. And I know not everybody gets to have a look inside your mind without working very closely with you every day. And I think this podcast will illuminate for a lot of our listeners, even more than they may have already come to know you, just how innovative you are and how special the work that you're doing for the industry truly is. And so I'm proud to call you my partner. And I think this was an awesome episode. We'll have to do it again.
Sounds like a deal.
All right, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Beyond Clean by subscribing on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify, or by downloading our smartphone application for iPhone and Android. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review, because your feedback is important to the show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, or if you've got a great idea to help build industry culture, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net, and we'll do our best to support you into your efforts. On behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.